Oh,
Hello,
hello,
everyone.
everybody. Oh, yep. My name's Jerome Wu,
I'm Michael Zhang.
and today we're going to be talking to you about John F. Kennedy, the man, the myth, and his 50-year-long eulogy.
All right, so starting off, we are going to go into this section, which is about his pre presidency, the A section. And we begin off with him as a Massachusetts House of Representatives member and eventually senator.
Yes. In order to understand John F. Kennedy before his presidency, we must understand some of the draws which the people had to him. To begin with, he was a connected creator. What this really means is that John F. Kennedy was the author of two books, both of which were nationally famous: the book Why England Slept and Profiles in Courage, both of which were whisked along to the national stage by his very powerful and influential family, but they were still bestsellers nonetheless, and established Kennedy as a sort of man of letters, as Mr. White would say. Secondly, John F. Kennedy was a very well known sex symbol. He was one of the youngest presidents to ever grace the United States. And in fact, he would go on to have affairs with very, very, uh, very influential women of the time, such as Marilyn Monroe and Jean Tierley. I can't pronounce her name, apologies, as well as being friends with very masculine icons such as Frank Sinatra. He was also a fairly unfaithful husband. He was known as a family man. However, throughout his 10-year marriage, he was very well known for having multiple affairs with multiple women, with even disregarding the high profile ones mentioned last time. He would often have affairs with his interns and secretaries. In fact, he even had a special assistant named David Powers, who was specifically tasked with finding women for John to have a little affair with. Next, he was also a war hero. This is very important. During World War II, he was the skipper of a torpedo patrol boat, and he saved a bunch of lives in the boat when it was taken down by a Japanese destroyer.
Right, and then here, as the last part of this pre presidency little bit, we have the beginning of his presidency with his inaugural address. And this is one of his most famous speeches, of course. You might have heard some of his famous quotations from this. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, so on and so forth. And this was really just establishing a lot of JFK's core missions, which included foreign policy that would have America protecting capitalism and going against communism. And here we go into the civil rights section of our exhibit, beginning with the Kennedys. Of course, we have John F. Kennedy as a proponent of civil rights during his time, especially towards the end of his presidency, and also Robert Kennedy, his brother and attorney general. And both of these men eventually saw fit to support civil rights more earnestly, and eventually Martin Luther King Jr. did come around and support them as well.
Mm-hmm. On that topic, our next exhibit is a lovely blown up manuscript of Martin Luther King's eulogy of John F. Kennedy. Indeed, Martin Luther King did uh, really, I feel like, have a very heartfelt message about Kennedy. He said, in fact, let me pull up the quote for you. He said, in fact, let us not mythologize. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. Let us not mythologize this man, as the facts do him justice enough. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy did, in fact, have a relatively progressive stance at the time, and I do not doubt that part of this eulogy or obituary, rather, was very much a true appreciation of that. However, it is unwise to not consider the position that Martin Luther King Jr. was in while making this obituary. He, throughout the letter, although he is very thankful to Mr. Kennedy, he also often uses his death as a way to rally support behind the civil rights movement as well. So, yeah.
Right, and on a similar note, we have the signing of the Civil Rights Bill originally proposed by Kennedy um, in 1963, coincidentally, also the same year that he did die. So, although Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill never got approved during his lifetime, after his death, then President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, was able to gather support after using JFK as sort of this martyr figure, and the Civil Rights Bill eventually did pass under LBJ. And although LBJ is often credited as being the great civil rights president, of course, and getting all these things done, it is important to note that Kennedy, well, it didn't actually happen under him, was the originator of this civil rights bill that was so highly acclaimed by proponents of civil rights.
Yes. Moving into Kennedy's foreign policy,
We do have one speech here to look at.
Apologies. I'm a little bit goofy.
A video that would be playing in this area would be the report to the American people on civil rights, another one of JFK's well-known speeches, and this comes after Alabama Governor George Wallace famously declared, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And the president saw fit to give a speech in response to these growing divisiveness issues of segregation, and he called in his speech for increased civil rights, to reduce discrimination, segregation, all these things. And it was actually in this speech that he originally put forth the idea of a civil rights bill that eventually became the one that we saw over here that was eventually put into law.
Mm-hmm. Although John F. Kennedy was a fairly progressive person for his time, that is not the only thing he did. We will now be discussing his foreign policy. The very first foreign policy thing John F. Kennedy did as president was instigate the Bay of Pigs happened under his institution. The Bay of Pigs is widely considered as a fairly humiliating defeat for the U.S. It was essentially, as a refresher, the plan was basically to train up Cuban refugees and then have them go back to Cuba and beat and overthrow the government. However, the Cuban refugees did not receive very much support from the local Cubans, and so it was crushed. While this did happen under Kennedy's administration, the reason why I was so hesitant earlier to attribute it completely to him was because he was fairly against this whole fiasco.
Moving on, another incident that happened under the Kennedy administration, while not necessarily his doing, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this was essentially the Soviet Union moving nuclear weapons into Cuba, and President Kennedy having to deal with this threat of nuclear war being in such close proximity, with nuclear weapons being right next door. And although it was a very tense and critical period during the Cold War, JFK is often viewed favorably as a result of his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, as we all know, did not end in nuclear war, and instead resulted in a de-escalation through his implementation of a quarantine policy. Of course, Kennedy did not act alone in this, but he is widely regarded as the one who came out on top of the situation and helped prevent disaster.
Mm-hmm. Something which is a little bit more controversial amongst historians was John F. Kennedy's escalation of the Vietnam War. It is probably foreshadowed already. His escalation of the Vietnam War was a fairly obvious move from Kennedy, if you were paying attention to his political beliefs before even he gained office. His first book was all about military preparedness and defense against authoritarian regimes by democratic countries. And as such, John F. Kennedy allowed for the greatest buildup of American troops and military personnel in a foreign country during peacetime up until that point in history. However, it is also important to note that after his death, John F. Kennedy was supposedly uh, letters from John F. Kennedy's were supposedly leaked about him having possible plans to end the war in Vietnam. However, because he never lived to make those plans happen, we cannot know what he really would have done and whether he would have just continued escalating.
Right. And we have another speech from John F. Kennedy in this section as well, surrounding the topic of foreign policy in this C block. Of course, a strategy of peace is what it's called, and this was given at the American University in 1963, prior to his death. This was a response to growing tensions over nuclear weapons, of course, during the Cold War. And in this speech, A Strategy of Peace, President Kennedy did call for nuclear de escalation, a nuclear test ban treaty, and notably, an eventual goal in the distance of nuclear disarmament. And although many nations did feel that was necessary to have nuclear weapons to protect themselves at this point in time, it was Kennedy's vision that there would be no need for nuclear arms in the future, hopefully. And this was well received by not only many of the American public, but also by Soviet leaders such as Soviet Premier Khrushchev, who eventually did agree to a nuclear test ban treaty, and many believe that it is this speech that it was a large part of it.
Are you going to cover this? Okay, whatever. This is the next section we're going to be doing is about the involvement of John F. Kennedy with the space race. The space race, as many of you know, was a sort of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, all about who could get to space first. John F. Kennedy, his lasting legacy in this regard was that he really made the American people interested in the space race. His speech, I'm sure you all know about space, about going to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. All of these things made it so that in the future, the Space Center would be named and dedicated to the late president.
Right, and here we have a little bit more about NASA and Kennedy's involvement with it. Of course, he did communicate through LBJ with Webb, director of NASA, and he was the one who eventually decided that it would be America's mission to put a man on the moon. And of course, that does not happen without budget, and so JFK is also known for increasing the powers of NASA in hopes of getting this person on the moon. And of course, we know that this did happen. As Jerome mentioned before, we choose to go to the moon, this famous speech of JFK for this section on the space race and JFK's involvement in the astronaut programs. You might remember some iconic quotes such as, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And other
Amazing
ideas.
accent.
Thank you. And other things such as this. Kennedy, of course, was the one who really invigorated a lot of the American public to support the space race, to support space programs in NASA. His idea of the new frontier, his set of programs and policies, was kind of mirrored by this idea of space as the final frontier. And we did choose to go there, and we did end up going there under Nixon.
Yes. However, as I'm sure you all know, and as the mausoleum-esque design of this museum suggests, John F. Kennedy was unfortunately shot during 1963, I believe, where he was shot in Texas. Frame 313 is a famous frame from a famous video of John F. Kennedy going through the Texas Houston roads. However, at frame 313, at that exact frame, you can watch Kennedy get shot in the head. His brain matter splayed across the asphalt as he died. as such, it is the centerpiece of this small portion of the exhibit. After this, Kennedy's wife, Jackie Kennedy, would indeed go on to try to memorialize her husband, to try to maintain his image in the public as rosily as possible. And as such, she chose to connect his image with the image of the mythology of Camelot. Specifically, she said he was some kind of Camelotian hero who died for the, I guess, beliefs and hopes of America.
Right.
And
And
as such, we will be playing Finale Ultimo from the, yes, woo, from the Camelot soundtrack in this little room.
right. And tying into, of course, Kennedy's enjoyment of the musical Camelot, which is where Jackie Kennedy got this Camelot metaphor from, we have the Eternal Flame, which was created by, or asked to be created by Jackie Kennedy after JFK's assassination, drawing inspiration from other Eternal Flames, such as at the Arc de Triomphe in France. And this does tie a lot back into the mythology of having this eternal flame for the Camelotian hero who died and sacrificed for some brave ideals and for some betterment of the nation. And lastly, we do have the funeral procession of John F. Kennedy, the state funeral that was held after his assassination. This funeral procession was of course grand and also marked a shift in the American perception of JFK from, of course, being a still popular president to being widely regarded and almost being seen as a martyr of sorts in the American mythos.
This is the second floor of our exhibit where we have determined and discussed what Kennedy actually did during his life, and now we can discuss what he became. John F. Kennedy, man of the people. This was one of the primary things which Kennedy was presumed to be after his death. He was a progressive, yes, during his time, and nobody can really argue with that. However, he was a relative centrist of the times. His policies were not as outstanding as some people may claim them to be. And ultimately, Kennedy, although, yes, very helpful for the civil rights movement, was not some kind of ultra progressive. In fact, many historians of the times now and even then considered him, as I said before, a moderate centrist Democrat. However, as we can see, and as such, overlaid through our magical hologram technology, we have overlaid this massive cross over the kind of obituary which Martin Luther King Jr. provided for Kennedy. Another little piece of evidence for this is the Times article comparing JFK to Dr. Martin Luther King, a radical, and also Abraham Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves. The Times was so infatuated not just the Times, the American public at this point really was so infatuated with the image of the president as this grand progressive that they would put him on the same tier as these two, I think everyone would agree, much more important civil rights figures.
Right, and continuing on, we have this idea of JFK as this sort of peace president. And here we can see this gigantic peace symbol over here. But once we take a look at what it is over the Cuban Missile Crisis, which JFK is known for coming to have come out of peacefully. But over here we see the other part of the Vietnam War and the Bay of Pigs invasion as just being X'd out in the public's perception. And this is really because a lot of people see JFK's peace speech, of course, JFK's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they assume that he was this peace-loving, war-despising hero who fought for American ideals through means other than battle. But of course, this was not the case, and as we talked about, the Cuban Missile Crisis was peacefully resolved, but the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Vietnam War were left lasting impressions that really go against this common conception of JFK as this peaceful president. And we come to JFK's perception as the president of tomorrow. Now, he is no Superman, no man of tomorrow, of course. He's just a person from Earth. But JFK did do a lot for advancing NASA, aeronautics programs, astronaut programs, and in general, furthering this idea that America could go on to our quote-unquote new frontier. And so this is depicted with a hologram check mark because it does seem accurate once you take a look at what actually happened, furthering of NASA, increasing budgets, developing the program to put a man on the moon. This was really what happened, and this is what we perceive JFK as doing. Now, of course, we did not land a person on the moon under JFK, but that was out of his control, and we believe that when you look at the facts objectively, the conception of JFK and the actual things that JFK did regarding space flight and the space race, they do line up very well.
The last thing that we would like to go over is JFK's perception as some kind of Superman. The section which this is going over is the 4 points of Kennedy's pre-presidency, his relatively nepotistic rise into the intellectual sphere, his sex symbol status, his affairs, and his, well, less so, I guess, his reputation as a war hero. That wasn't really exaggerated that much. He was actually, well, I guess we can all agree that he was pretty brave to, swim around in the freezing, like, Pacific Ocean to save a bunch of people. So I think that's pretty accurate. However, the other parts of his character were vastly exaggerated. As mentioned before, the nepotistic aspects of his rise into the intellectual space at Harvard is massively underplayed. He, in fact, the Pulitzer Prize win that he got for courage, profiles of courage, was in fact largely due to the incredible amounts of publicity and things his very, very, very influential family was able to give him. The same goes for whatchamacallit. The same goes for Why England Slept. In addition to this, his status of a sex symbol was true, yes. However, at the same time, he was also viewed as a family man. His family and his quote-unquote family values were viewed as very important parts to his character, even though, as discussed before, he had many, many affairs with many different women during his stint in the White House. However, even though all of this was happening and people were all very aware of this happening, oh, we're breaking the glass ceiling, guys. Even though people were very aware of this happening, the Times Magazine still chose to mostly publish images of him and his adorable little children and his lovely wife into their magazines, therefore cementing him forever as a symbol of pure family and ignoring all of the more unsavory things he did in bed. We hope that this exhibit has given a little bit... Oh, wait. Actually, before we go, this isn't really an exaggeration at all, but I just thought it was kind of funny that they did in fact make a JFK G.I. Joe doll. I thought that was pretty funny and also ties in a little bit to that war hero perception. We hope that from this exhibit you were able to find that JFK is not in fact a myth. He is not some kind of immortal Superman, but he is in fact a mortal, just a man. And we hope you enjoyed our exhibit.
Thank you.
You know who else is mortal? Michael Zhang. That was so